Welcome viewers. Today in this part of the program, we shall discuss the modern theory of the rent. In the earlier part of this program, we have discussed the Ricardian theory of the rent. Rent is a return for the use of the original and indestructible power of the soil, and it is an indication of the niggardliness of the nature. This theory, which is called as the Ricardian theory of the rent, which is the primary theory of the rent, it talks about the indestructibility property of the land, that the properties of the land are original and indestructible. With that, land has only one use. There is only one factor of production, that is land, which can be used, and rent can be arised from the use of the land. Simultaneously, rent is the product of niggardliness of the land, that is, land is scarce, and because of that land arises. Modern theory of rent. Modern economists viewed that rent may accrue to all other factors of production, provided the supply of these factors is imperfectly elastic and land has alternative uses. Keeping in mind the limitedness of the first theory, that is the Ricardian theory, the modern economists like Alfred Marshall, John Robinson and Bowling, they propounded a new theory which is called as the modern theory of the rent. Now, this theory of the rent says that rent accrues not only to the land, but to all other factors of production like land, labor, capital and other factors of production. And why rent accrue? Rent accrue to these factors of production because these factors of production are scarce, because they have inelastic supply, and simultaneously rent accrue because all these factors of production, they have alternative uses. That means they have more than one uses and they have inelastic supply. Hence, the modern theory of rent is based on the speciality of factors of production, which are of two types: perfectly specific factors and perfectly non-specific factors. So, there are two categories of the factors of production: perfectly specific factors of production and perfectly non-specific factors of production. Now, these perfectly specific factors of production, they have very specific use, and when they are used in one work, they cannot be used simultaneously in the other use. On the other hand, the non-specific factors of production, they have no specific use as such, and they can be used in more than one work simultaneously. According to the modern economists, rent is equal to actual earnings minus transfer earnings. Actual earning is income accrued to any input in excess of its total supply price, and transfer earning is the minimum earning of the factor to keep it in its present use. So, economic rent, according to the modern economist, is the difference between actual earning or actual income minus transfer income, or which has another name, that is opportunity income or income arising due to opportunity cost. Now, actual earning is the earning which accrues to factors of production or any input in excess of its total supply price. Whatever is its minimum supply price, over and above that supply price, if any factor of production is giving income or income is arising due to that, that is called as actual income. On the other hand, that total minimum supply or minimum supply price is nothing but transfer earning. So, actual rent or actual earning and transfer earnings difference gives us the economic rent, or this is the modern definition of the rent. Now, this table will gives us the actual illustration that how actual rent or economic rent arises. In the first column, actual earnings are given. In the second column, transfer earnings are given, and the third column shows us the economic rent. Now, the first row shows us that how actual earning accruing to the factor of production is rupees 10,000. With that, transfer earning is also 10,000. That means the factor of production neither is a specific factor nor a very non-specific factor, because both actual earning and transfer earning, they are equal. In this particular case, there will be no rent, no economic rent will be there. In the second row, as we can see that actual earning is rupees 10,000 and transfer earning is 0. So, the end rent accruing is rupees 10,000, which means that the producer is using has no other use. The factor is a very specific factor of production which cannot be used in any other production process. So, that is why whatever earning is there is the economic rent. So, here in this case economic rent is equal to transfer earning. The third row gives us the illustration of the partial specificity of the factor of production. As we can see that actual earning is rupees 10,000, transfer earning is rupees 5,000. So, the rent accruing is rupees 5,000. That means the factor of production is neither specific nor non-specific. It is partially specific. So, that is why in its alternative uses, this factor of production is giving a rent of rupees or transfer earning of 5,000. So, the difference between actual earning and transfer earning is rupees 5,000, and this is for the partial specificity of the factor of production. And the last one, that is actual earning, again rupees 10,000, transfer earning rupees 15,000. That means the factor of production it is getting in its present use. So, the factor of production will leave that particular owner and move to some other owner of the factor of production, which is providing him more amount or more transfer earning is there. And when the factor of production will move into that production, this transfer earning, that is rupees 15,000, will be its actual earning. So, the gap of 5,000 will be the economic rent. So, there is one case only when the economic rent is the maximum. That is the case when the factor of production is perfectly inelastic, or you can say perfectly specific, and it has no other alternative use. Why rent is paid? Rent is the result of relative scarcity or when supply is less than demand. Thus, elasticity of supply is behind the rent. Now, what is rent? Rent is the result of scarcity, because any factor of production is less in amount and its supply is less than its demand. So, whenever supply is less than demand because of scarcity, this rent arises. So, we can say that this concept of economic rent is basically related to the elasticity. What is elasticity? Elasticity is the proportionate change in the quantity supplied of the factor of production due to proportionate change in the price. Now, there are two types of factors, factors whose elasticity is very high, relatively high or perfectly high, and there are factors whose elasticity is relatively less or perfectly inelastic factors of production. The factor of production is perfectly elastic, which means a small change in the price of the factor of production and the supply changes more than proportionately. That means the supplier is ready to supply that factor of production more than proportionately. That is perfectly elastic supply. Now, as it is shown in these two graphs, the first one, as you can see in this graph, price is taken on the y axis and quantity is taken on the x axis. DD is the downward sloping, that is negatively sloping demand curve, and SS is the supply curve. Now, what does the shape of the supply curve depict? The supply curve is a horizontal straight line SS, which means that price is not changing, but quantity is changing. you can change, even if there is a small change in the price, quantity will change more than proportionately, which means that the supply of the factor of production is perfectly elastic. That means whenever producer would like to increase the supply, he can increase the supply. Whenever he wants to decrease the supply, depending on the irrelevant of the price. So, it is perfectly elastic. Now, we can see that this horizontal SS supply curve is intersecting with this negatively sloped demand curve at point E. So, this is the point of equilibrium. Now, this is from origin to P is the price of the factor of production, and at this price till this point the quantity is provided, or this is the total quantity. Now, this entire area, that is from O, P, S and quantity, shows us the actual income, and there is exactly no rent. Why there is no rent? Because this entire area which shows actual earning is equal to the transfer earning. Why this is equal to transfer earning? Because this particular factor of production has no alternative use. It is not at all a specific factor of production. It is a non-specific factor of production whose elasticity is very high. So, that is why the factor of production has multiple uses. Therefore, there is no rent accruing in this particular case to any factor of production. Now, coming to the next graph, which shows you a perfectly inelastic curve. There is similar demand curve, negatively sloped demand curve, and this negatively sloped demand curve has unitary elasticity. But here the supply curve, that is SS, is perfectly inelastic. Perfectly inelastic means here that even a small change or a drastic change in the price is not going to change the quantity. As we can see that quantity is fixed here, quantity is not changing whether the price is this or this or this. This is called as, or this is defined as, perfectly inelastic supply curve. Now, this perfectly inelastic supply curve provides kind of specific feature to the factor of production, that this particular factor of production is very specific. So, now this area, this square is shows you that here the transfer earning, that is the opportunity cost of this factor, is 0. That means the factor is so specific that it has no other use. Take for example, a land where only wheat can be cultivated, no other crop can be cultivated, because the land, the feature of the land is like that. So, this particular land is very specific in cultivating wheat and has no other use. So, this rent is coming out of actual earning and transfer earning is 0. So, that is why this entire square or this entire space is showing rent, and this is the economic rent. So, now we can say that factors that do not change with their demand have inelastic supply, or maybe because they are so specific, their demand remains constant. The factor is perfectly specific, the factor has only one use and no other use. So, that is why the transfer earning is 0 and there is only actual earning. So, when the transfer earning is 0 and when there is only actual earning, so that actual earning is equivalent to the economic rent, and the rent arises and the producer have to give economic rent. Now, factors having perfectly elastic supply will be perfectly non-specific in nature and their economic rent is 0. Now, we will talk about third case, which neither is for the specific nor for the non-specific factors of production. Relatively elastic supply. Supply of factor increases but more proportionately than the demand, and factor is partially specific and partially non-specific. This is the case when the supply of the factor of production is neither very elastic nor very inelastic. It is somewhere between inelastic and elastic. Now, the economic rent in this particular case, it will depend on the elasticity of the factor of production. As we can see here again, we are taking the same variables on the y axis and the x axis, that is price and quantity. Our demand curve is same, negatively sloped, but the supply curve here is neither horizontal nor straight or perfectly inelastic. It is comparatively or relatively elastic. It could be relatively inelastic also. Now, depending on the elasticity of this supply curve, the rent will be fixed. As in this particular case, the supply curve is relatively elastic. So, relatively elastic means that the factor of production has transfer earnings and it has alternative uses. So, it is more closer towards non-specificity rather than specificity. It is not very specific, but it has alternative uses. So, as we can see in this figure, the triangle, that is S, P and E, is the rent. Now, how this rent is accruing? Now, look at this square, this entire from origin to P to E to quantity is nothing but actual earning, and from origin to S to E and quantity is transfer earning. So, the difference between this square and origin, S, E and quantity will give us rent. So, as you can see now that more this supply curve will be tilted towards perfectly inelastic curve, the rent will be higher. The more this curve is closer to the price, the rent will be less. So, this tells us very specifically that rent, according to the modern economists, it is accruing due to some special features of the factors of production. Now, relation between rent and price. Individual producers' view. Rent is for the use of all factors of production. Rent should be included in cost and recovered from price. From industry's point of view, opportunity cost is required to keep the factor in its present use. So, it is part of the cost and should be included in the cost. Now, why we are talking about this relationship between rent and price? Because ultimately, when the price of the product is determined, rent plays a very important role. In case of the Ricardian theory, rent has no role in price determination. But in case of modern theory, as we can see that there are two views, view of individual producer and view of the industry as a whole. Now, according to individual producers, whenever a factor of production is hired, it has to be paid, and because it has to be paid, there is a cost existing there, and that is why this cost should be included in the price, and hence it plays a very important role in price determination. On the other hand, from the point of view of the industry as a whole, the factor of production which is being used by the producer has some alternative uses or some opportunity cost. So, when that particular factor of production is retained by paying the price, that price or opportunity cost should be included in the cost and hence in the price. So, from both like individual producers as well as industry, both point of views, the rent should be included in the price and recovered from the price. Quasi-rent. The concept of quasi-rent was given by Marshall. It is the surplus earned by the instruments of production other than land. It stands for the whole of the income which some agents of production yield when demand for them suddenly increased. Now, this is another important concept of rent, that is quasi-rent, which is not a true rent. So, what is it? The concept of quasi-rent, it was given by Alfred Marshall, and basically it is related to the time period of the supply of the factors of production and as well as the time period of the production. As it can see, it is the surplus earned by the instruments of production other than land. Land is a natural factor of production, but there are other factors of production which are actually not natural, and when there surplus of these factors of production and this surplus is provided to the producer in the short term and the long term, then due to the fixed time period, basically this quasi-rent arises in the industry, and it stands for the whole of the income which some agents of the production yield when demand for them suddenly increase. Like during the process of production, demand for certain factors of production suddenly increase. Take for example machines. Instead of one machine, the producer requires 2 machines, or instead of 2 labor, the producer requires more than 2 labors because the demand is increasing. So, in that case, this concept of quasi-rent was developed. Now, it is earned when supply cannot be increased in response to an increase in the demand for them. Hence, this is a short term concept. That is why machines earn rent in short run, which disappears in long run, because it is a quasi-rent and not a true rent. So, again, as I told you that it is the difference between the supply and demand. Now, in short run, when the time period of production is very, very short, we cannot take for example, in one good season demand for any product is increasing, but the time period is very short. So, supply cannot be increased immediately. So, in that particular case, the rent because of more demand and less supply accrues, and that is called as the quasi-rent. So, it appears because of the short run fixed nature of the factors of production, and that is why this concept of quasi-rent, it disappears in the long run. With the relaxing time period, this concept also disappears. Now, in this figure, we will explain the concept of the quasi-rent. Again, as you can see that on the y axis, that is the vertical axis, we are taking price. On the horizontal axis, we are taking quantity. And as I told you that this concept arises because of the inelasticity of the supply. Here we are taking, this is SS is the supply curve, which is a vertical line. That means the supply curve, supply of the factor of production is inelastic. This is the initial demand curve. DD is the demand curve in the beginning, and as we can see that demand curve is intersecting the supply curve at this point, that is E. So, this is the first equilibrium point. Now, this is the entire rent, actual rent or the economic rent, that is from origin to P to E to S. And as I told you earlier that because supply is inelastic, so this here actual income or earning is equal to the economic rent and transfer earning is 0. But now what happens when in short run demand of this particular factor of production increases? So, as we can see that supply cannot increase, supply is inelastic, so price will move up. This is the basic law of the demand and supply, that when supply cannot increase, there will be an upward pressure on the price and the price will move from origin P to P1. Now, as we can see that because demand has increased from DD to D1 and supply is not changing, this demand curve is intersecting supply curve at a new point of intersection, that is E1. So, now we can see that this from origin to P1 to E1 to S is the whole quasi-rent, and now this quasi-rent is appearing or it has appeared because of the change in the demand or increase in the demand from DD to D1, but no change in supply curve, inelasticity of supply curve. Now, as we can see that this is the inelastic supply curve, which is only possible in the short run, because in long run supply usually does not remain fixed, it can change, and this concept of quasi-rent, it basically disappears with the change in the time period. So, this is a short term concept. Now, after doing the concept of rent and quasi-rent, we can compare these two concepts, rent and quasi-rent. Rent is the total rent paid to the owner, used in price determination. It is a permanent concept, exists in long period. So, what is rent? Rent is a concept, total rent accruing to or the true rent appearing while using any factor of production. And it is used, as I told you, that it is used in price determination. It is a permanent concept. Once it appears, it will remain for that particular time period. And Simultaneously, it exists in long period. On the other hand, quasi-rent, surplus income emerging due to scarcity, not used in price determination, temporary and short period. So, quasi-rent is a concept which appears because surplus is emerging out of the scarcity of the factor of production. That particular factor of production which producer want is scarce. And why this is factor of production is scarce? Because of the time period, because time period with that producer is less, it is very short time period. So, that is why the factor is scarce. Simultaneously, this quasi-rent concept is temporary in nature. So, as the producer's production moves from short run to long run, this disappears, and this has nothing to do with the price determination, because it is not a true rent and it disappears with the time period. So, that is why producers, they cannot use this term in fixing up or in determining price. So, today we talked about the modern theory of rent and how modern theory of rent is an improvement over the old recurrent theory of rent. Then we talked about the earning or the economic rent, which is a difference between the actual income and the transfer earning, and why this rent accrues or why this rent appears because of the inelasticity of the supply of the factors of production. Other than land, it appears. So, this is the modern theory of the rent we talked about, and we also talked about the specific factors and the non-specific factors of production, and we talked about quasi-rent. That quasi-rent appears because of the factors of productions are fixed in supply. It is a temporary concept, it appears in the short run and it disappears in the long run. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed and understood the concept of rent.